there are some cases that never truly close and fade, because sometimes the most disturbing questions come after the confession. In 2018, the world watched in horror as Chris Watts admitted to murdering his pregnant wife, Shannon, and their two young daughters. The case seemed straightforward. He pleaded guilty. He evaded trial, multiple life sentences. Case closed, but was it? Over the years, fragments of information have resurfaced. Interviews, letters, statements from people who claim to have spoken with him behind bars. And now, new discussions are circulating again. This time focusing on one name that continues to divide public opinion: Nicole Kessinger, the woman he was having an affair with. Officially, she was never charged. Officially, she cooperated with investigators. Officially, there was no evidence tying her to the murders. But in true crime, official doesn't always silence suspicion. A recent deep dive documentary by the YouTube channel Behind Criminal Minds explores claims coming from one of Watts's former cellmates, suggesting that the story might not be as simple as we were first told. Tonight on Sinister Tales, we're not here for reckless speculation. We're here to examine what's being said, where it's coming from, and whether it changes anything about. Sinister Tales is growing into a global community, and I always read through them. And if you appreciate true crime that focuses on analysis over noise, make sure you like this video and subscribe. It helps this channel reach more viewers who want facts, depth, and respectful storytelling. In just a moment, we'll be incorporating segments from Behind Criminal Minds. Full credit goes to them for their production and investigative breakdown. As you watch, pay attention to the details, the wording, the timeline, the claims, because in cases like this, the smallest detail can reopen the biggest question. Let's step into the shadows once again. On June 14th of this year, Chris Watts' former cellmate, Dylan Tallman, released a new book series that claimed Nicole Kessinger was directly involved in the crimes that Watts committed on August 13, 2018. My name is Dylan Tong, and my doc number is 504,789. And Chris Watts is my brother and my music co-author. Tallman's books offer new insight into the potential motivations and mindset of Chris Watts, providing us the first detailed accounting of Kessinger's purported influence leading up to the crimes, with the books even going on to assert Nicole's alleged involvement in the crimes themselves, making the claim that she was present at Survey 319 the morning of August 13th. In today's video, we will continue our deep dive analysis through the timeline of events, relying on the primary evidence and supported facts surrounding the case. And after, we will contrast the evidence against the backdrop of Tallman's version of events, leaving it to you to decide if his new claims ring true, with the ongoing hope that as we continue to uncover each layer of the evidence that justice will soon have its day. This is In Search of the Truth, Part 2 of the Chris Watts Deep Dive series. When we last met, we revisited the final 2 weeks leading up to the morning of August 13th, 2018. The discovery records provided insight into the trials and tribulations that Shannon faced during that time, as she desperately tried to find a way to restore a marriage that Chris was already bound and determined to destroy. But just hours after Chris would enact his cruel and unfathomable crimes, his vain attempts at secrecy would unravel under the weight of Shannon's family and friends, who from the very beginning would not relent. They were determined to hold Chris Watts accountable for the truly monstrous acts that he had already committed. But it's in this retrospective that we remember and affirm that no victim deserves the crimes perpetrated against them, and no amount of influence takes away from their responsibility that Chris Watts bears now and always. So with that said, let's begin. Just after 5:18 a.m. on August 13th, 2018, we see the lights from Chris Watts' truck turning on. Moments later, we see this person walking towards Chris's work truck, and in future installments, we will return back to this moment in time. Less than 1 minute later, Chris's work truck is parked in the Watts family driveway. We now know through law enforcement's body cam footage in their discussion with Chris's neighbor, Nate, that this was the first time that Chris had ever parked his work truck directly in front of his garage. It quickly became evident to law enforcement that Chris clearly intended to obscure anyone from seeing what he was loading into the back of his work truck that morning. Over the next 18 minutes, Chris can be seen loading and unloading various items into the back of his truck, including tragically his own family. And just after 5:45, Chris Watts leaves his driveway en route to Survey 319 with both of his children still alive in the back seat. It's now 6:16 a.m. and Nicole Kessinger makes a call to her close friend Jim. 3 days later, during Nicole's first and-off interview, Detective Kobach would ask her if she was willing to verify her whereabouts for the afternoon of the 13th of August. Nicole would acknowledge that up in arriving home that day, her friend Jim was already present at her apartment, which meant that he could confirm her arrival. However, when pressed to confirm her alibi, this is how Nicole Kessinger responded. From an investigative point, he could be person who could say, "Yeah, I was there at 3:45. He doesn't know Chris, he doesn't know anything." He could say with one phone, "Yeah, she came in at 3:45. Done. Totally. Do you know what I'm saying? And I don't have to ask anything more than, 'Hi, Chris, my name's Kevin, or Jim.' And I'm not saying you have to give it to you. Leave Jim alone. If at some point I needed Jim's info to, let's say, we couldn't find your phone records, would you tell me? I will give them to you. Would you tell me who Jim was if I could? If you had to. I don't really want to involve him in this. That's not fair to him. That's not no. If I do not have to do that, that's fine." Nicole's friend Jim is just one of many rabbit holes throughout the vastness of Watts Island. But during one of Nicole's final interviews with Detective Kobach, he mentioned that she had pictures on her phone of a heavier-set man who was with her at the same time she and Chris were at the sand dunes. Nicole then confirms that the picture was of her friend Jim. And this confirmation would mean that Chris knew exactly who Jim was. And it's Jim who Nicole called in the minutes just after Chris left his house to go to Survey 319 that morning. On its face, Nicole's call to Jim doesn't appear to be out of place. She frequently called him in the days and weeks prior. However, it's Nicole's location when she made that call that has caught the attention of everyone who has ever evaluated her phone records. But there's something about this entry that even law enforcement overlooked. In the months of Nicole's prior phone records, we are able to ascertain her exact route to and from work. Thanks to these records, we can observe the roads that Nicole Kessinger used on her daily commute from her home to her job at Anadarko and back each and every day. The consistency of her route is the most important part of these records, and this is why. Because on the morning of August 13th, 2018 at 6:16 a.m., for the first time in the history of Nicole Kessinger's supposed drive to work, her phone is now pinging somewhere that she has never previously been. And the tower that her phone is pinging from would place her in the same proximity of the Watts family home. The exact same address to the house that Nicole Kessinger Googled less than 36 hours earlier. The journey to the oil well site was a little over an hour away from the Watts residence. But while Chris was headed there, he would begin calling and texting his coworkers just after 6:30 a.m. Watts initially tried calling Cody Roberts 3 different times before finally sending him a text asking him where you at. 1 minute later at 6:32, Roberts responded, "Just got fueling Kirsty." It's very likely that Chris panicked when he received this message because he knew that Kirsty was approximately 30 minutes away from Survey 319, and Chris was still 15 minutes away from the job site. If Cody made the decision to go and help Chris unannounced that morning, it would have completely upended his plan. Moments later, Chris attempts to call Cody, who again did not answer his phone. 1 minute later at 6:33, Chris sends a preemptive lie to Cody. "Okay, I'm already at Survey 319, but not wanting to leave anything to chance, Chris sends a second message to Cody. Where are y'all going first thing this morning? Roberts responds DPC state. Chris replies in sickening relief with a thumbs-up emoji. But just when he thinks he's in the clear, 2 minutes later, Roberts texts Chris again, informing him that one of their coworkers, Chad McNeil, was also planning on going out to survey 319 that morning to work on the well site. Watts immediately asks Cody to confirm with him if he should be expecting Chad to show up that morning. Cody replies to Chris, "I think Chad might be heading out there today." His phone was breaking up pretty bad, though. Moments after receiving that message, Chris now begins to try and call Chad McNeil, who he now knows could likely show up to what will soon be the epicenter of a massive crime scene. Chris knows that he cannot arrive to the work site with his entire family in the truck, especially if his coworkers show up while he's trying to hide the monstrosity of his crimes. So, as he speeds down the highway, Chris picks up his phone and tries to get Chad to answer, but again, no response. 2 minutes later, and it's now 6:49. To those who are familiar with everything that transpired over the course of the next 30 minutes to an hour, all we know with certainty is that whatever remained of the man that Chris Watts was prior to the events of this day, that man no longer existed. And no one will ever be able to help me to understand how anyone is capable of what Chris Watts himself has admitted to doing just after he arrived at Survey 319, the morning of August 13th, 2018. But this was just the beginning of Chris's cowardice that day, because at 7:40 a.m., Chris sent Shannon a spoof text that was a calculated measure meant to establish his future alibi for Shannon and the girl's whereabouts. It was a cruelty intended only as a means to temporarily fool Shannon's friends and her family. In the message, he said, "If you take the kids somewhere, please let me know where they are at." And he sent those words while standing mere feet away from them. Moments later, Chris called Troy McCoy and then began sending various messages to his coworkers that he knew were planning on showing up to the crime scene that he had just created. But at 7:43, Chris Watts took a picture that many now believe establishes that Nicole Kessinger knew far more than she would eventually claim to law enforcement. Over the next hour, Chris's coworkers would begin to show up to the work site, completely clueless to what Chris had just done. No one noticed anything particularly strange with Chris concerning his demeanor, his clothing. In fact, the only thing that seemed out of the ordinary was the physical location of where Chris parked his truck that morning, but nothing that would have in any way revealed the clues to the crimes that this location would now bear. In retrospect, it's hard to imagine how or why Chris Watts ever thought he would get away with this. Over the years, many have speculated that Lawrence played a role in the irrationality of Chris's behavior. Limerence being a sort of infatuation that created a blind obsession that all but prevented Chris from having a rational view of his own actions. Truthfully, I have resigned the mental valuation of Chris Watts to the professionals, because the more I learn about what he has admitted to doing to his wife and children that morning, the less I care about his reasons. At 8:25 a.m., Chris would stage another call to Shannon's phone, and just 1 minute later, he would search for Primrose School at Vista Ridge. Primrose was the academy where his girls were supposed to be enjoying their first day of school. Instead, Watts would call the school and concoct a story about how the girls would no longer be attending. And before the staff could even formulate much of a response, Chris hung up the phone. Just after 9:00 a.m. and Shannon's phone sends out an appointment reminder. It was for a doctor's appointment that would become one of the early catalysts that would warn Shannon's friends and family that something had gone very wrong. Moments later, Chris would make another exceedingly odd phone call to Tohi's real estate agent in Meadows. 2 days later, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, aiding the Frederick Police Department, would call Ann to speak with her after learning of her connection to Chris and Shannon. CBI agent Stacy Galbraith spoke with Ann, who explained the strange conversation that she had with Chris on the morning of the 13th. Since the beginning, Ann had almost exclusively dealt with Shannon during the overall process of buying and selling their home. In fact, to that point, She had only ever spoken with Chris twice ever. So, the fact that Chris was calling her and asking if she had spoken with Shannon was not just odd, it was completely out of place. Chris then proceeded to tell her that he and Shannon were getting a divorce, and that she was the very first person even before his own family to learn of this new and considerable life change. Less than an hour later, Centura Health would call Shannon's phone and leave a message after she failed to show up for her 9:15 appointment. And at 10:10 a.m., Chris Watts opened Google and searched for the lyrics to the Metallica song Battery. We have since learned that Chris shared these exact same lyrics with Nicole Kessinger, who replied by asking him what the song meant to him. Between the pictures of volcanoes just hours earlier, the cold and apathetic mannerisms that Chris had been displaying towards Shannon, the lies surrounding his night with Nicole at the Lazy Dog, the affair that he intended on turning into a marriage, and even his own concurrent statements that he had been premeditating these crimes for weeks prior. It's beyond evident that Chris Watts' obsession with the woman and life that he would never have completely overshadowed whatever good may have existed in him before he chose to destroy his family over a complete mirage. 10:28 a.m. Sandra Rusick, Shannon's mother, worriedly texts Chris asking him, "Is Shannon okay?" The two would speak minutes later, where Chris would manufacture the first iteration of his story, claiming that Shannon was in one of her moods, that they had a small fight the night before, and that she was going to a friend's house. At 10:33, immediately after lying to Shannon's mother, Chris is now searching for hotels in Aspen, Colorado. He even called the Westin Snow Mass Resort in Aspen just 9 minutes later. And this is where I want to ask you, the audience, a question. Why do you think Chris was searching for a hotel getaway at this specific moment in time? Now, we can all agree that Chris's behavior was not that of a man who anyone would qualify as being cogent. However, it would seem that his primary motivations during this period of time were solely based on the preservation of his relationship with Nicole Kessinger. And if you recall in Dylan Tallman's books, Chris was reported to have said that on the morning of August 13th, just hours before this hotel search and phone call, Nicole had allegedly told him to choose between her and his family, and that when he did choose her, she held him and promised that she would marry him and said that she would take care of everything for him. So again, I want to ask you, Textion, if Nicole Kessinger was truly oblivious to Chris's actions, as she will later claim, then why would Chris be making plans that included her unless he believed that she would go? Moments later, at 10:44 a.m., Sandra Rusick calls Chris again. She would go on to call Chris one final time, as it was now becoming completely obvious that Chris was not going to help the Rooch checks locate Shannon. That in fact, he was likely the reason that Shannon wasn't answering her phone. Just after 12:16 p.m. and now every single one of Shannon's friends and family are becoming aware that Shannon and the girls are missing. Chris then receives a message from Josh Rosenberg. "Hey bro, Cassie asks me if I've heard from Shannon today. I guess she and Nikki can't get a hold of her. Have you heard from her at all today?" But while Josh, Cassie, and everyone were trying to find answers at this exact moment in time, Chris is preoccupied taking this picture of the surrounding landscape. Flowers, and more specifically, sunflowers, had been a sign of Chris's devotion to Nicole Kessinger during the entirety of their relationship. In fact, just weeks before, we can see that on July 16th at 8:35 a.m., Chris took a picture of sunflowers near the Anadarko corporate office. One day later, on the 17th of July, Chris again took pictures of flowers that he no doubt shared with Nicole. Because that following day, on the 18th, his relentless love bombing over the past several weeks appears to have worked. Eventually, when law enforcement did search what little evidence remained on Nicole's cell phone after she deleted virtually everything from it, they did find a considerable number of flower pictures in her phone, many of which were likely sent by Chris during the course of their affair. It's now just 1 minute later at 12:17, and Chris receives an alert on his Vivint Security phone app. On his app, he can see Nicole Atkinson standing in front of his house, trying to get inside in an attempt to locate Shannon and the girls. Chris knows that Nicole Atkinson will not find them there. So, hoping to keep the situation at bay, he calls her and speaks with her for just under a minute. Watts had still not responded to Josh's text, so at 12:21 p.m. Chris finally sends a message back. "I just talked to Nikki. Shannon went to a friend's house with the kids today. I haven't heard from her since. I will keep you updated though." Josh would reply by telling Chris that they were worried. Chris responded the way that he always does, cold, apathetic, a man who seems like he truly does not comprehend what empathy is or how to use it. At 12:27, Watts calls Nicole Atkinson back. He's now starting to realize that she's not going anywhere. It's around this time that Chris leaves work to head home because Nicole Atkinson has made it clear that she's not backing down until she finds Shannon and the girls. Atkinson had already been deeply involved in trying to locate Shannon throughout that morning. As we know, she had picked up Shannon from the airport and dropped her off just hours earlier, right around 1:45. Atkinson was already deeply aware of the problems that Chris and Shannon were having. She had also been a part of the ongoing conversation surrounding his strangely expensive meal at the Lazy Dog, and she knew of Shannon's despondency over the possibility that Chris was having an affair. But Nicole also knew that Shannon had an important doctor's appointment with Dr. Stephanie Traver that same morning at 9:15 a.m., an appointment that was made specifically for gender and genetic testing for her pregnancy. So when 9:15 came and went and Shannon wasn't answering her text or calls, Nicole Atkinson stepped into action and went to the doctor's office with her son. When she arrived at Centura Health's office, she learned that Shannon was a no-show to her appointment. It was at that moment Thatch knew she needed to find Shannon, so she rushed over to the Watts residence and began looking into their house to see if she could find any signs of Shannon and the girls. But at that moment, Nicole Atkinson had no earthly idea just how important of a role that she was about to play in a crime that Chris Watts was already desperately trying to cover up. At 12:27 p.m., Chris is in the midst of his own self-inflicted chaos when he receives a message from his realtor, Ann Meadows. She says, "Hi, I'm working on your market analysis. I would like to bring my listing coordinator with me when I bring it to your house. Did you finish the basement? Are there any other upgrades to the house?" A few minutes later at 12:31, Addie messaged Chris asking if Shannon was okay. "Everyone is worried. It's not like her to not respond, and we haven't heard back from her all day." Chris would initially ignore this message, but by this point in time, it's obvious that he has completely underestimated Shannon's friends and family, let alone the lengths they were about to go to force Chris to be accountable for everything he had just destroyed. 10 minutes later, and Chris is back on the phone with Nicole Atkinson while rushing home. But just 2 minutes later, after their 40-second phone call, Shannon's friend Cassie stages the first significant confrontation of Chris in her valiant attempt to get answers. Cassie messages Chris at 12:43. "Shannon is in a very bad way emotionally, and I'm worried about her. I know you're having issues, but I don't know to what extent. However, I do know that I have never seen her so broken to an extent that I am worried." Chris responded, "She went to a friend's house with the kids, but she won't tell me where though. When I get home, I will update you." A few minutes later, Cassie messages again. "Sweetie, nobody knows about you or here other than Nicole Atkinson and I, so where would she go if not with Nikki or not to Arizona where I'm at? Her car is not like her, Chris." Now, I believe that what Chris is about to say in response to that message is closely. "I told Nikki about what was happening so she wouldn't freak out anymore. I think Christina knows as well. Shannon and I talked last night and I told her I want to sell the house and get something smaller. Separation would be best right now if we can't work through our issues." Now, essentially Chris is saying that in response to Nicole Atkinson showing up to his house that he told her that him and Shannon were having problems and that she left to a friend's house. He poorly conjures these god-awful lies that no reasonable person would ever believe, seemingly as a means to buy time. And while he's racing back to his house, in an effort to stifle Nicole Atkinson's determined attempts at gaining entry into his home. Chris ends that text message by saying this: "I really don't want you to think that I'm a bad person, Cassie." This is a sentiment that Chris Watts continues to hold to this very day. In fact, in Dylan Tommen's book, he even reflects on this very same issue. Chris and Tommen are having a discussion about how they are viewed by the public. Chris says, "I wish people would judge me on my whole past. Instead, they only judge me on that one day." And to those who question the veracity of Tommen's books, it seems to me that this is exactly something that Chris would say, because he lives under the delusion that his previous life as a parent and as a husband somehow absolves him of the horrific things he had done just hours before sending this text message. Chris seems more concerned about how he's perceived than taking any form of responsibility for his actions. And that's precisely why Chris Watts has sprinted towards an entirely new obsession with religion, because he cannot handle the fact that he is objectively a bad person. But it's this next comment by Cassie that is the literal definition of catharsis. Because right after Chris sent his pathetic attempt at looking for validation, mere hours after what he had just done, Cassie has had enough. "Right now, Chris, I don't care about you. I don't care about your relationship or what type of person you are or are not. And I don't even care what I think of you. And I'm not trying to be rude when I say that." And right after, Cassie says exactly what all of us are thinking. Chris continues to demonstrate the apparent actions of an unbothered sociopath. Because while he's racing back home, he makes sure to take the time to respond to his real estate agent's previous questions, telling her the basement is still unfinished. No other upgrades. By 10:03 p.m., Cassie is done messing around. She rightfully chastises Chris, telling him that her only concern is for his wife and for her well-being. She tells Chris that Nikki is calling the police, saying that Shannon is broken emotionally. She explains to him that Shannon's blood sugar dropped due to no dating and it could easily cause her to pass out. So unless he wanted the police to bust down his door, he better get home and check on his family. 2 minutes later at 10:05 p.m., Chris responds, "I'm going home, Cassie. I'm on my way. Don't call the police. I will be there in 45 minutes. It's hard to imagine what would have happened if Shannon's friends were not as involved in her life as they were if Chris had been given the opportunity to spin his lies uninterrupted for just one more day. Just after 1:13 p.m. and Troy McCoy texts Chris asking if everything was okay, telling him, "If you need anything, let me know." 1 minute later and Chris is still answering random, completely unimportant questions to his real estate agent. At 1:31 p.m., Nicole Atkinson calls Chris again, trying to ascertain where he is. He tells her that he's still en route and he will be there shortly. But Nicole Atkinson refuses to wait even 1 minute longer. So she calls the Frederick Police Department and eventually speaks with Detective Dave Baumhover. During the call, she conveys the urgency of the situation, that Shannon was not only pregnant, but that she was also diagnosed with lupus and diabetes. Atkinson would explain that after she left Shannon's doctor's office, she arrived at the Watts residence and tried to gain entry into their home. However, the front security door interior latch was locked and prevented her from accessing the house. It was then that Atkinson's son looked in the garage window and noticed that Shannon's vehicle along with the girls' car seats were still inside. Just after 1:40 p.m., Officer Coonrod responded to Nicole Atkinson's request for a Atkinson attempt to see if they can gain entry into the house or to locate Shannon and the girls. Approximately 15 minutes later, Chris Watts arrives, and this is the first time we get to see just how suspicious his behavior was from the moment he stepped out of his vehicle. Eventually, Chris is interviewed by Detective Baumhover, who arrives at the scene a short time later. Chris will concoct his first set of lies to law enforcement, claiming that her disappearance was only because he and Shannon were having marital problems. He told Detective Baumhover that he woke up at 4:00 a.m. and left for work at 5:27. However, like most things with Chris Watts, none of that was true. Chris claimed that both he and Shannon were in tears that morning. However, they did not argue and that Shannon had told him that she was going to take the girls to a friend's house later that day. Throughout the entirety of this body cam footage, the only thing we know at this point in time with certainty is that Chris was capable of committing a crime the details of which most people could not begin to fathom. And just hours later, he is completely calm, cool, and collected. It's why so many of people have made the assertion of psychopathy when analyzing his behavior and body language because, regardless of what Watts or his family has to say, he appears completely unbothered. However, that was about to change when law enforcement learned that Chris's neighbor Nate had evidence that proved that Chris was the only person who was seen leaving the Watts residence that entire day. Watching this footage of Chris Watts standing there, hands above his head, clearly panicked and barely able to breathe or maintain his composure, is one of the few moments that we actually get to see Chris squirm. Because it's this footage that not only confirmed what law enforcement would go on to use to prove their case against him, it would also become the cornerstone of the allegations against Nicole Kessinger. And before we're done with this series, it's my hope that you will understand exactly why. By 2:10 p.m., Chris is now receiving messages from many of the friends of Shannon. Christina Meacham texts Chris, "What's going on? Where are you? We are so worried." 1 minute later, Chris staged another fake text to Shannon sending, "Where are you?" just after 2:11 p.m. Around that same time, Shannon's friends, Cassie, Christina, Nicole Atkinson, and Addie all began a group text, sharing their growing concern over Shannon's well-being. 2:26 p.m. Chris responds to Christina Meacham, "The police are here. I'll call you when I know." Shortly after 3:46 that afternoon, law enforcement finished their first interview with Chris Watts, and it's clear to them that nothing is adding up. They would find Shannon's phone, her purse, her car, her medications. Everything is still in their house along with the girls' car seats and everything else that Shannon would have brought if she had ever left the house that day. At that time, Addie messages Chris to inquire what's happening, conveying her concern over the worsening situation. Shortly thereafter, the two would speak on the phone for just over 6 minutes. But as soon as Addie got off the phone with Chris, she sent a group message to all of Shannon's concerned friends. The police need to look at Chris's cell phone and his computer. The discovery records tell us a tale of the pain that everyone endured because of Chris's selfishness that day. It is still hard to fathom what he did, let alone why. But one thing was clear throughout every page of these records. Shannon Catherine Rushik was loved by everyone Andinion who knew her. It's 4:22 p.m. and Kelly Burke inquires what law enforcement is saying about the search for Shannon. Chris let her know that a missing persons report would be filed the following morning if Shannon hadn't turned up by then. A few minutes later, Burke asks Chris if Shannon was awake when he left for work that morning. Chris continues the lies by saying, "I only talked to her early this morning between 4 and 5 a.m. I think she went back to sleep afterwards. She was still there when I left. Kids still sleeping." Burke responded to Chris telling him that she's scared, and this time Chris would actually tell the truth. He told her that he was too, but Chris's fear was for an entirely different reason. At 5:01 p.m., Nicole Kessinger attempts to call Chris twice. Unfortunately, he doesn't answer either call. Nicole will go on to tell law enforcement that Chris had texted her earlier, mentioning in passing that his family was gone, and asked her to call when she could. But Nicole will also claim at the exact same time that for the entirety of this day she was not concerned at all about what Chris told her surrounding the events of Shannon and the girls disappearing that day. Nicole will claim that she just assumed that Shannon took the girls to a friend's house and that there was nothing to be concerned about. By the evening of August 13th, every one of Shannon's friends and family were in a complete and justifiable panic. They would eventually suggest to Chris that he should call all of the local hospitals in the area to make sure that she wasn't admitted for a health-related emergency. At 6 p.m., Chris would call 4 different hospitals in the area, including Good Samaritan Medical Center in Lafayette, St. Anthony's North Health Campus, Longmont United Hospital, and UC Health in Broomfield. And Chris made these calls to check to see if Shannon and the girls was at any one of them in just 4 minutes. In Detective Prill's discovery report, he realized that Chris could not have made all 4 of those calls in such a short amount of time. So he got on the phone and called each hospital, asking for a completely fabricated person to gauge the amount of time that it would have taken for Chris to receive a response. And it came to no one's surprise that it took 2 minutes just to get an answer from one of the hospitals, let alone all 4. But by 6:23 p.m., Kelly Burke asked Chris if he had any luck in his attempts to locate Shannon at any one of those local hospitals. All he said back was, "No luck at all." More lies at 6:30 p.m. when Realtor Ann Meadows asks if Shannon was okay, making note of the fact that she had been absent from their group chat discussion that whole day. Chris responded saying she hasn't been around all day. It's very odd. At 6:52 p.m., Chris messages Samantha Pasley telling her, "I'm praying so hard, I'm sick to my stomach. Cops searched the house up and down and drilled me pretty hard. I have no idea where Shannon and the girls could be." A little more than an hour later, Chris responds to Samantha one final time. Law enforcement was just being thorough. They got to do all the digging they can. I saw Thegirls this morning and yeah, people are helping me search. You don't need to get on a plane, though. We have a lot of support here. This is it. This is why millions of people all across the world completely abhor Chris Watts and the things he did that day, because he could have chosen so many other paths. He could have just left Shannon and got a divorce. And I do not want to hear from anyone attempting to victim blame that Shannon was mean to him, because what he did to his wife and children had nothing to do with the flaws in her. They had everything to do with the flaws in him. And he proved that with every one of these messages to her friends, her family, and even to her own parents, because he willfully fed them false hope, knowing full well the grave site he left behind at Survey 319. And to this day, there's no signs of contrition, no heartfelt apology, there's zero humility. And the evidence that Chris Watts was absent of any meaningful contrition for his actions was about to be put on full display the evening of August 13th, when he would get on the phone with Nicole Kessinger for the last and final time. In 2015, I underwent major spine surgery after a serious car accident that completely totaled my vehicle. Just days after my surgery, the insurance adjuster called to tell me that they would not be covering the cost of my expensive surgery. Despite the fact that I had provided the insurance company everything that they had asked for, and the fact that the accident wasn't my fault, the adjuster made the decision that my medical bills would not be covered. One of the dark secrets about many insurance companies is that they will go to great lengths to avoid paying you what your case is worth. And I found that out the hard way. After having undergone extensive surgery on my spine, weeks of physical therapy, and recovering from the trauma of my injuries, the insurance company offered me $4,500 for my pain and suffering. At the time, I didn't understand that when you are seriously injured in an accident, your case could be worth millions. So, I made the decision to stop fighting the insurance company alone and sought competent legal representation. Exactly the kind of expert representation you can find in Morgan & Morgan. Morgan & Morgan is the largest personal injury firm in the United States. They don't settle for the insurance company's often junk lowball offers. In fact, in just the past few months alone, they have achieved incredible outcomes for their clients. $12 million in Florida, 34 times the highest offer from the insurance company. And in Philadelphia, they achieved a $26 million settlement, a staggering 40 times the highest insurance offer. And easily one of the best parts of working with the competent and experienced lawyers of Morgan & Morgan is the fact that the fee for their services is free unless they win your case. Additionally, working with them can be done online from your phone. There is absolutely no need to visit their offices or schedule any appointments. So if you are ever seriously injured in an accident, remember that your case could be worth millions, and you are only a few clicks away from potentially changing your life. It's incredibly easy to do, and you can start your claim right now by filling out the form shown on your screen in under 2 minutes by visiting forthepeople.com/behindcriminalminds. Again, that's forthepeople.com/behindcriminalminds. Their link is available in the description and the pinned comment. And a special thank you to Morgan & Morgan for sponsoring today's episode. Just after 9:48 on August 13th, the day of the crime, Chris Watts called Nicole Kessinger, and the two would initially speak for about 50 minutes. 30 minutes later, Nicole would call Chris this time, and they would speak for 52 minutes. Later that night from 12:08 to 2:18 a.m., the two would speak off and on for an additional 54 minutes. And to those counting, that would mean that from 9:48 p.m. until 2:18 a.m., a span of just about 6 hours, Chris and Nicole spoke for a combined total of 2 hours and 36 minutes. And just wait till you hear what Nicole Kessinger says when she's asked to recall their discussion that evening on Monday night. So, a couple things. I told you he had texted me, and then at the end of the night, he had called or I had called. I think he called me, but either way we were on the phone with each other, and like part of at some point when we were on the phone, he was like, do you want to FaceTime? And I remember I was laying in bed and I was just like, you know what, okay, let me turn on the light. And I remember I turned on the light and we FaceTimed. And when we FaceTimed, he didn't really say much. Like it was almost kind of awkward. I don't even know why I didn't think of this earlier, but it was like it was very short too. It was super brief. And what's short? What is short? Like a couple off minutes or 30 minutes. Oh no, I bet it was only probably like less than 5 minutes. I think it was only like a couple of minutes. Okay. Now, without context, listening to Nicole's interviews with Detective Kobach can be so deceptively benign. If you didn't know the details surrounding that evening and everything leading up to it, if all you heard was her talking about her conversations with Chris that night, I could understand why many people made the wrong first impression and assumed that she was not involved. But as they say, the devil's in the details, so let's keep listening. I think we were like talking a little bit, but he was laying down on a mattress that didn't have any sheets on it. And I was like, okay. So I was thinking like, well, maybe he's in bed. I don't know what's up. But I remember asking him like, where's your sheets? And he's like, oh, I washed them. And then this is the part I don't remember if thy sentence right here came in this FaceTime conversation, or if it came in a phone conversation prior to the FaceTime conversation. But regardless, this next sentence came on Monday night. And I'm so sorry that I cannot always remember chronological every little detail. That's okay, it's understandable. There's so much. But I remember Hugh was saying that he was cleaning the house, to try to keep busy, to take his mind off of things, and this was on the phone. So far, Nicole has successfully deflected Kevin Kobach's questioning by insinuating something sinister surrounding Chris's laying on his bed without his bed sheets. She knows that it implies that he was up to no good, but she also knows that she spoke with Chris for nearly 3 hours. And there's something else she's hiding about the morning of the 14th that she's praying Detective Kobach won't bring up. I didn't honestly think that much about it originally because that man is always cleaning. Like he's a very, very organized, meticulous, clean individual. Like he's the type of guy that will vacuum his whole house 1 week, and if there's rooms that don't get used, he'd vacuum again the next week just because it's like part of his routine. Okay, so the fact that he's cleaning to kill time and take his mind off things did not seem like a super red flag to me. Every time that Nicole Kessinger is trying to deflect, every time that she is attempting to subvert the truth, she accomplishes this very much like a magician. In one hand, she provides you with a distracting story that very likely has elements of the truth while at the same time using the other hand to hide whatever it is she doesn't want law enforcement to see. Nicole's comments about Chris doing laundry and the bedsheets sounds incredibly contrived because again, she's still hopping that Kevin Kobach will not find the one thing that she cannot explain. And I'm not sure if you've noticed yet, but she has still yet to describe what they've talked about in any demonstrable detail. So anyway, so that didn't seem outa like the norm for me, but something that just kind of like dawned on me last night is he made the comment directly after that. He said, I had to wash the kids' sheets. He was like, they smell. And I was thinking about that last night and I'm like, this man keeps that house so clean. That's like the cleanest house I've ever seen. And I'm like, this man keeps the house so clean. Why would his kids' sheets smell bad? And this, you think this was Monday night. What time do you think it was Monday night? Oh God, I don't even know. I almost wish you guys would show me my own. I'm going to read off your phone calls for Monday and Tuesday starting Clear's throat. No, it's on Monday. Okay. Monday night. Monday night you guys had we talked about a phone call yesterday, but y'all guys had a phone call Monday night. It looks like he called you. It was 48 minutes and 57 seconds. It was at 9:48 p.m. that he called you. So that would take us to about 10:35. And then there's another call on Monday. It's for 51 minutes and 25 seconds. It looks like I'm not sure looking at this who called who, but it looks like you called him and snorts that was at 11:09 p.m. that lasted 51 minutes. So that takes us to midnight. And then there's another phone call where he calls you. So we're now into midnight, Tuesday morning. It's a 30-minute phone call that lasts until 12:38. Clears throat, and then after 12:38 a.m., there's a 2-minute and 44-second phone call that lasts for, or pardon me, that starts at 1:12 a.m. It's 2 minutes and 44 seconds. These are the words of a seasoned professional of deception and deceit. Nicole knows exactly what she said during those phone calls with Chris. We know she does because she will later provide law enforcement with a detailed, exhaustive timeline of the entirety of her relationship with Chris, providing painfully accurate details about events that had occurred weeks and months earlier. But the phone calls Nicole and Detective Kobach are discussing right now just happened 4 days prior. And the reason why this moment matters so much is because of what was happening at 2:07 a.m. the morning of August 14th. Now, I want you to listen to Nicole's answer clearly and without interruption. It's long, but it's important because this is the one and only time that Nicole provides a reconciliation of those conversations. And remember, what you're about to hear satisfied law enforcement, CBI, the FBI, and DA Michael Rohr as a sufficient answer concerning what they discussed for 156 minutes, less than 24 hours after Chris Watts committed his crimes. So yeah, I would almost, this is just me, but I would go get my text messages with him from that night and I would sync them up to that time frame because there was texting in between that. So I think what happened is he called me on that first call, and then there's that gap between the first call and the second call. In that gap. That was when we FaceTimed for a few minutes, and that was when I got up out of bed because I was just having trouble sleeping and I was like I went and did laundry. That's what I did. I went I just put some clothes in the dryer, and then I think I called him back, and then we continued to talk. So that little gap right there between those two big phone calls at the very beginning of the night. I mean, not the very beginning of the night, but the big ones at the first two. So in between that gap, there's a quick FaceTime. So do you think that 2-minute and 44-second is Clear's throat, the FaceTime? The one at the very end. Yeah, well, so I don't even think the FaceTime's on there. The FaceTime occurred in between those two big phone calls that I know. Okay. 'Cause it was like one big phone call, and then there should have been there's a FaceTime and then, and the FaceTime's short. It's only a few minutes and then there's probably just a few more minutes, and that's probably what there's a few more calls on Tuesday. So 112 is the 2-minute and 44-second call that lasts till approximately 1:14, and then there's a long gap until 1:50. So another 45 or 35 minutes, and then there's a 7-minute phone call. That phone call lasts till 1:58 a.m., and then there's a 10-second phone call at 2:07 a.m. followed by so I think he calls you and maybe leaves a voicemail or something, or doesn't, you don't pick up. So there's a 10-second call, and then directly after that there's a 10-minute and 24-second phone call. Okay, so I'm talking about the two at the very beginning. Okay, the too long, and is that when he's talking about the kids' sheets with the sheet? Okay. So yes, 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 yes. I will help you line this up. Like I almost want to just come in there and like drop and drag all of my text to where they were going. You know what? We may meet and do that here come early next week. Did you hear what just happened? Nicole was asked several times about her discussions with Chris during their nearly 3-hour-long phone call. And instead of answering the question, she offers to come down there and help fill in the gaps. And guess what? That never happened. But something very important did happen just before 2 a.m. that night of the 14th. While Nicole was speaking with Chris during the call that began at 1:51 a.m. minutes later at 1:58, Chris began receiving a number of phone calls from the Frederick Police Department. So Chris and Nicole got off the phone, and at 2:05 a.m. Chris returned Officer Ed Goodman's phone call from his work cell phone. But mere seconds later, Nicole Kessinger called Chris's cell phone and stayed on the call while Chris was being interviewed by Officer Goodman. And the interview we have been listening to between Nicole Kessinger and CBI agent Kevin Kobach took place on the 17th of August, less than 4 days after Nicole eavesdropped on Chris's discussion with law enforcement. And it just happens to be the exact same phone call that would become the very last time that Nicole and Chris would speak again. But I have a question. Why would Nicole want to know what law enforcement was saying? If she was not involved in this crime in any way, then why would Chris have her on the other line listening in? Remember, Nicole would claim in her first in-person interview that she didn't even suspect Chris of anything until the following day. So, knowing what you now know, listen to the very next thing Nicole Kessinger said as Detective Kobach began to press her about these calls. Yeah, well, all those phone calls at the very end of the night, that was me freaking out. Like if you look at my text, a lot of that was like, I can't sleep, I'm really scared. Where's your family? That was like me freaking out and him calling to like try to reassure me, or me calling him like, please talk to me, I'm super scared. Where's your family? Like those little ones at the very end of the night are me not being able to sleep and trying to get him to like talk to me about like just I guess making sure everything was okay. So those like real light ones. And that's why they're all kind of like sporadic, 'cause I'd be up for like an hour, and then I'd fall asleep for like 15 minutes, and then I would like wake up and start stressing again and try to come back, like, so that's why they're all these like little sporadic ones throughout the end of the night. But those two big ones is so yesterday. We talked about Tuesday was mainly text messages regarding your confrontation about his wife being pregnant. Doesn't all of this start to make a lot more sense now? Because again, if Nicole Kessinger isn't involved, then what would she have to be so scared of? Why is she unable to sleep? Why is she asking Chris to calm her down? If she wasn't involved, then what is she so panicked about? But it's probably not a surprise by now, because immediately after Nicole implicates herself by virtue of her reaction alone, Detective Kobach responds by completely changing the subject. Nicole Kessinger had spent the last 2 months gallivanting around with a man who she knew was married. She never once showed any concern over Shannon's well-being before. In fact, she outright refused to even say her name. But even more importantly than all of that combined is, if Nicole was not involved, then she had no reason to suspect that anything had happened to Shannon or the girls during these initial calls. Because I would like torment you that 24 hours before this conversation took place, Nicole conducted her first in-off interview and previously said this. Did that strike you as odd? But you were thinking maybe she just left. I just thought she needed to get away from the situation. I mean, that didn't seem that awkward to me, that a couple that is going through separation would be like where I need to leave. I just need some space. It didn't even process. I was okay, give her some space. I really thought she left. I was let her go. You know she'll come back in a day. She'll be all right. Let her cool down. She'll be here. It'll be okay. You know, how do we convince, I think she's just upset and it's here that I want to contrast what we've learned against the backdrop of Dylan Tallman's books. After taking the time to read them, there are a few important things that I've learned. I, like many of you, have a healthy dose of suspicion anytime new claims arise from Watts Island. And it's for that reason that I have evaluated Tallman's claims by trying to ascertain if there is any uniformity to the way that he describes Chris Watts. Much of what he conveys is identical to how we know Chris communicates, the way that he speaks through coded religious idioms, and more importantly, the univocal narrative that he provides, which is synonymous with what we already know of Chris Watts. In Tallman's second book, he writes about a discussion that he had with Chris concerning the morning of August 13th. He states, on the morning of August 13th, I was going to check in with Nicole because we had plans to meet up before work. My plan was to skip work and spend the day with her until all of this transpired. I immediately thought of Nicole, and I thought perhaps we could start over somewhere in North Carolina. But losing my wife made me feel doomed. Alone, especially the thought of losing my mistress too. So I met up with Nicole where we were supposed to rendezvous on the way to work. She was so calm about the whole situation. She told me to just go to work like I was supposed to, and she asked me about the girls. We talked it over for a while, and we decided that we could make it look like they went missing. Now, if this account is to be believed, it would mean that on the morning of August 13th, Chris not only met with Nicole, but that she helped encourage and direct him on how to cover it up. Tallman's next segment goes on to say, when Chris was asked what they decided to do with Shannon after he had already committed his crimes against her, Nicole responded by saying that she would take care of it. Later on, Tallman confronts Chris and asks him if he had any help in the commission of the crimes against the girls. Chris responds by saying, "Yes, I did." Tallman asks him, "Did Jezebel help you?" Chris sighed and eventually he responded, "Yes." Over the last 6 years, so many of us have quietly watched and listened to the countless documentaries and iterations of this case. Every single time we are reminded of these moments, we grieve with her family, knowing the unimaginably heavy price they continue to pay for a crime that should just never have happened. This retrospective is our way of continuing to advocate for justice for the people who matter most in this case. Shannon, Bella, Cease, and Nico. But we also want to remember all of the victims of violent crime that happens all over the world. This case is representative of what happens far too often in the criminal justice system, when law enforcement applies blinders and forgets that a conviction is not justice. Justice is incomplete until everyone involved is held accountable. And as we near the end of another year, we hope and pray that we are one step closer to justice. And until a time where that hope becomes a reality, we will never stop advocating for what's right. We will never stop advocating for the truth.